Welcome to another episode of Solving Your Driver Problem, where we bring guests who have real tactics and strategies to help you fill your empty seats, pass every audit, and bring them home safely. Today, we have Rob Boroff, who's a partner with Gallagher Sharp. He's part of the rapid response team, which is why we have him on the show today. He sleeps with his shoes on because speed is mission critical to responding to an accident. Rob, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks, Scott. Great to be here.
Well, let's do a quick high level. How the heck did you get in this industry?
That's a good question. You go to law school after college, and in law school, there's not a course for trucking law or how to defend trucking companies and truck drivers. So I wish I had a better story to tell, but the long and short of it is I just fell into it. And I really could not be any happier being in this industry, just learning this industry. It's a really hands-on piece of law. So it's nice that I don't have to be in my office all day, every day. And instead, I'm out getting my hands dirty with trucks, going out to accident scenes, speaking with drivers, speaking with trucking companies, and speaking with other folks in the industry, such as yourself.
So how did you get into the rapid response team? That's not something that most attorneys do. And when I met you, I stayed out there, so I feel the need for our listeners. He's one of the good ones, guys. He defends us. He's not the evil plaintiff side. So Rob, how did you fall into the rapid response team?
Yeah, that's a good point, Scott, to point out. I represent and defend trucking companies and truck drivers. That is 95% of my practice. And when I first started out in this industry as a defense attorney, being or having a rapid response team was something that's relatively new. And now it's become really an integral part of defending trucking companies and truck drivers when they're involved in an accident. So when I was coming up, it was really developing this process and protocol of what to do after an accident. And rapid response is really just that. It's not uncommon for myself or one of my partners or associates at Gallagher Sharp who are on our trucking team to get a call at 9 o'clock in the morning, but maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock at night on a holiday. It's a 24/7, 365-day job. And when we get that call, boom, we're out getting our procedures, protocols into place and making sure that we're doing everything that we can to put our clients, the trucking company and drivers, in the best position possible in the short term, but also the long term if a claim or lawsuit ever comes about.
So today we're going to talk about what do we do when it happens and how do we prevent it in the first place. So, but let's say, all right, you get that 3 a.m. call. So you're taking the call at 3 a.m., Rob. So it's clearly about urgency and speed after an accident. Why?
Yeah, that's a good question, Scott. And the reason is, as you would probably know from the technological side of things, information and data and documents can get lost, and they can get lost very fast. So one of the things that we do right away is we are gathering information about the vehicles that are involved in the accident. And one of those vehicles are usually one of our trucks. And there's a module on many trucks nowadays. Really all of the trucks, the newer trucks these days, have engine control modules or other event data recorders on them. And that information can sometimes get overridden by a turn of a key, by moving that vehicle a few feet. And so what we're trying to do as soon as possible is gather that data from the engine control module that has information usually about speeds, distances, the way steering wheels turn, the moments leading up to an accident. And we want to make sure that we obtain it and preserve it. And we do that right off the bat. And that's just one of the pieces of the rapid response that we're really focused on right off the bat.
Yeah, and I get it's complicated, and it's a simple question of why, but there's more to it as well. And from my understanding is that it's key is documentation of what happened up front as well, because quite often, from my understanding, is that neck that hurts doesn't tend to hurt that day, right? It might be a week later when they get repped. And so on the scene, that documentation, what does that look like to make sure that somebody's neck doesn't start hurting a week, 2 weeks, a month later?
Hard to prevent that. The folks on the other side, the plaintiff's attorneys, a lot of them I'm friends with. So this is not to demean the plaintiff's bar by any means, but trucking company or an insurance company for a trucking company has a large amount of insurance usually. The federal minimum now is $750,000. Typically, most trucking companies have $1 million. And just compare that to the policies that we have on our personal vehicles. And I don't need to ask you about any personal information, but I can tell you my primary policy is not $1 million. And most people's policies of insurance on their personal vehicles is not anywhere near $750,000. So sometimes what can happen is that plaintiff's attorneys see that a truck's involved in an accident. They know that there's quite a bit of insurance to potentially recover, and they focus their attention on those trucking companies. So Scott, you're absolutely right. Sometimes those no liability cases or accidents that have just really insignificant damage do turn into something. And again, I don't mean to speak ill of the other side, but that could be because there's quite a bit of insurance to be had.
Sure. There's a good, right, there's the with them. They're looking for the dollar out there. I mean, the billboards have proven it, but they're hurting a truck, right? It's not hurting a car, it's hurting a truck. That's what the billboard says. So our clients have shared with us, Rob, the letter, as we refer to it, and it says, please give us all these things. Many times those records that they're requesting, will be logged. So many times it's the DQ file, training records, etc. With your negotiation with the plaintiff attorneys, who may or may not be your friends, right? I know you're you know each other, right? You run into each other a lot. What's the first thing you do to try to stop that, right? Or as I live in the Heisman house, right? So to give them the Heisman, the stiff arm right away, so it doesn't, that $50,000 incident doesn't balloon to $1 million.
I like that. Well, I think there's two components to that we have to look at this. We have to look at it from the pre-accident side or the pre-claim side of things and the post-accident, post-claim side of things. And so what you're bringing up, Scott, is, hey, what happens if we're involved in an accident and we get that letter of rep or that preservation letter? How do we stop that? Well, I think stopping that happens much further before the accident happens than anything else. So let's just talk about that for just a little bit, that pre-accident side of things. And I think it's really, I'm very happy to have been connected with you, Scott, and Avatar Fleet, because it's companies like yours that really make my job easier down the road. And a lot of times trucking companies aren't really thinking about the claim side and litigation side of things, and they're really just thinking about their own business and the bottom line, which I can completely understand. But sometimes money invested up front really goes a long way down the road. So a company like yours, Scott, to my knowledge, and you can feel free to chime in if I'm missing anything, but with Avatar Fleet, you're qualifying drivers, right?
Correct.
And you have folks in your business or maybe who you contract with who can connect trucking companies with drivers, but those drivers may or may not, I believe that they're vetted by you or a contractor. You work with companies as well to perform DOT audits and make sure that the motor carrier itself is really operating pursuant to the federal motor carrier safety regulations. I mean, would you agree with some of those things that I'm saying?
Yeah, we do that, or our clients use our software to do it themselves. But either way, exactly what you're describing of vetting the right, sorting through the pile of names to get to the diamonds, the needles in the haystack. And then once the ones you have, maintain that file, right? So you can provide that documentation. Exactly right. Yep, that's what we're up to.
And in this industry, how hard it is to find drivers today. It's a real challenge to my clients, trucking companies. I'm sure it's a challenge with your clients as well. And, sometimes trucking companies may want to take the shortcut, and that is going to hurt them down the road. So getting in line with companies like yourselves or having in-house folks who are vetting drivers, who are ensuring that they're staying on top of the regs is just the first piece of keeping off and staving off those claims down the road after an accident happens. So really the first piece of advice that I would give is to make sure that trucking companies, motor carriers are really operating in accordance with the federal motor carrier safety regulations, making sure that they have qualified drivers, making sure that they're maintaining appropriate driver qualification files, making sure that they have pre-employment drug tests going on, that they're part of random drug test programs. That is only going to help you down the road to show these plaintiffs' attorneys, hey, I'm operating a reputable business here. I've got a reputable trucking company. We're doing things by the books. So if you're going to try to turn this into something it's not, you're really going to be met with a really hard wall, or that Heisman pose, as you put it. So that's really the pre-accident, the pre-claim side of things, where trucking companies, your clients, can really get ahead of this and get in front of these potential claims right off the bat. Okay?
Yes. So Rob, one way we connected was through a company, Blue Wire, who we both respect of what they're doing for the industry to curtail those runaway verdicts, as Steve Bryan would say. You're in the courtroom. What are some of the things that plaintiff attorneys are digging at? After and I'm asking this from a prevention standpoint. What are some of their go-tos that they're getting at, their layups that they're hitting all day long that are causing problems for your clients?
Yeah. So there are ingredients that we've identified, whether it's through Blue Wire, through other organizations that I'm a part of, such as TIDA, the Trucking Industry Defense Association. These are the preeminent trucking organizations on the defense side who represent trucking companies and truck drivers. And what we're finding is that plaintiffs' attorneys are on the other side for a while now have not been focusing on the accident itself. They don't get into the nitty-gritty of, well, how did this accident happen? What plaintiffs' attorneys have determined is that if they can assign fault or place fault on the trucking company itself, that is that recipe for getting those runaway verdicts. Now, how do they do that? They really dig into the documents and to the technology that trucking companies are using, right? So they will request that driver qualification file. And if they see that it's not being maintained or created in accordance with the FMCSRs, they're going to focus on that. They're going to look at driver's logs. And nowadays, you have to have e-logs. If for some reason a trucking company is not using e-logs and they've got paper logs, that's going to be a problem. If they look at the e-logs and they can find that there's some type of fraudulent activity going on, which frankly is very hard to do, but I've seen it, not so much in the more recent years, but I think it used to be a little bit more possible to do. They're going to focus on that. And they're going to then place the blame on that trucking company and say, you have these protocols in place or these safety procedures like driver's logs, or let's say drive cams, and the trucking company has drive cams, but they don't turn them on. Those are the types of things that plaintiffs' attorneys are going to focus on to really put the blame on plaintiffs, on the trucking company, to really drive up those verdicts. Then, of course, you have some other aggravating factors that are always never good, like a driver who's under the influence, a driver who may be distracted. And those types of facts really drive up, those verdicts that we're seeing.
It's an interesting summary, Rob, that a client of ours, the way he described it just stuck with me. Was he said what he digs about what we do together is we help him build the wall, is what he calls it, not the border, but the wall of documentation. And his point is, what you described is it's not attacking that event or that accident itself. It's attacking the safety culture or the company's commitments to safety. And so what he loves doing is saying, no, man, I go above and beyond. Here's my proof. You sure you want to fight? Because there's more where this came from. And he hits them hard and he hits them early. And he goes over the top intentionally to show everybody's like this. If we were at fault, it's going to stop here. Don't take me to trial because this was an isolated incident. And on the best case scenario, and I got the footage and it's actually your client's fault. Right.
Yep.
That's the ultimate offense that I see out there. Anything else you're seeing like that of pro tips to flip it and you know, the best defense I think is a good offense in this scenario. Any other pro tips you're seeing out there?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, let's talk about the drive cam. I mean, I touched on it, and I think you were just touching on it as well. 5-10 years ago, when this technology was coming out, at our conferences and our meetings with other defense counsel and industry people, and I have to admit, I was one of those people, totally against, let's not have drive cams. We don't want to see, you know, the bad stuff, because we were thinking of it from a defense standpoint and not really realizing, wait, how many times have our trucking companies been involved in sideswipe type accidents, and our clients have just paid money because it's a he said, she said, we can't really prove anything, and the culture out there is that the public really maybe doesn't trust truck drivers, even though they really should. I mean, these are people who it's their profession, it's their job, that's how they make money, so they take this job very seriously. And over the last 5 or 10 years, getting back to the drive cams, I cannot tell you how many times having that footage actually helped my client. And whether it was a sideswipe, an unfortunate suicide, I've had some where you can actually see a person jump in front of a truck because they wanted to end their life, but there wasn't a note to be left, so nobody really knew. But it was apparent from the footage that that's what happened. The other offense is gathering those documents. The worst thing that we can do is lose that information, such as the drive cam footage or GPS data that you can get from some type of, whether you have a GPS device inside, if you have like a Qualcomm, PeopleNet type device inside the trucks, that has data on it usually that shows speeds, and you can disprove some of the claims that are being made by the other side. So that's why it's so important for trucking companies, for your clients, Scott, to have people who know what they're doing, whether it's an attorney, whether it's your in-house folks who know what they're doing after an accident occurs, because you got to get this information, you got to preserve it, and then you got to go out and find what else might be out there. Just a real quick, war story. I had an accident down in Florida a few months ago because I'm national counsel for one of the largest fleets in the United States. So it doesn't matter where an accident happens. It could happen in Florida, Texas, wherever. We get the call and we handle the investigation from Cleveland, Ohio. So there was an accident down in Florida. We know exactly who we need to get out there. We have folks on the ground 2 hours after the accident happened. We get surveillance video. We get information about where the other person involved in the accident was located. And what we've developed since that time is, number one, that person on the motorcycle, the claimant, was traveling more than 2 times the speed limit. And number two, he was intoxicated. And we found that out because we knew where he came from. And then we send out, a preservation letter of hang on to all your receipts. We get receipts. It shows that he's been drinking all night. And then months later, when we get the toxicology report from the autopsy, boom, that proves it, that he was more than 2 times the legal limit. So what we thought was a terrible accident where we were going to be at fault, and we're like, oh no, has now turned into, oh, this is a very defensible case.
Well, the rough stats we hear, 80% of the time it's the four-wheeler's fault. So in that scenario, the cameras are the number one defense, when that situation happens. And to your point about the 20%, one of our mutual friends has said, hey, if I can see it though, and we know that we're wrong, well, then that's when our checkbook's out to settle quickly, because we screwed up, and let's own it, and let's not drag this thing on.
Yeah.
Either way,
that's a great
way you're ahead.
I always tell the plaintiff's attorneys on the other side, and maybe this is a negotiation tactic, but it's not an intended tactic by any means, but I truly believe this, that I work with great people, and sometimes insurance companies, trucking companies, certainly the trucking industry, get a really bad rap that, somehow that we're just dangerous on the road and we're out there to move as quickly as possible and act unsafely. And it's simply not true. Think about it from a business standpoint. Is that a business model
Right.
that would work if you're out there trying to hurt people or trying to move as fast as you possibly can, knowing that there's maybe a greater risk of hurting somebody else? No, of course not. And from the truck driver standpoint, is that a good business model for you if all you know is how to drive truck and you're going out there speeding and trying to act dangerously? No, of course not. And so what I say is, these are good people. My clients are good people. And when we're wrong, and we understand that. And we're going to compensate that other person reasonably and fairly. But when we're not wrong, we have to defend ourselves. It just has to be done. So for that 20% or whatever the percentage is of when we're at fault, it's really not a tough discussion. It gets done. We find that reasonable spot and we make sure that that other person is reasonably compensated fairly.
So those are the areas I want to dive into, Rob. But you mentioned something a few minutes ago that I took a note I just want to circle back on, which was when people become desperate for drivers, the analogy I liken it to for standards is the frog that's boiling in the pot, that over time, that something like one thing may get a little looser, get a little looser. And then next thing you know, you've got different standards than you did 3 years ago, simply due to desperation. And that is where that we've learned over the years. Why did we get good at what we call our purple cow marketing? Is because we can't talk about safety and retention with companies if we're not filling seats up front. And so when you are, and it is a numbers game, right? So you're always going to have to sort through this funnel to get to the desired outcome. But we do have customers that are doing that. That's part of the fun. Hey, we had a testimonial last week for the first time in 20 years, all of his trucks are full. Now we can have this chat, right, about being pickier, about following that documentation, following those standards. So he wanted to follow the high standards. He does not want to have accidents. When you look at 10 empty trucks against the fence for 20 years, you start to do something different. And one thing you mentioned, though, that's key is kind of a duh, but it's worth calling out, is that your documentation doesn't keep up with your practices. You may not be doing anything slimy or illegal. You might have just changed. But if your policies that are posted that are discoverable for your job descriptions, company handbooks, whatever it is, if it's discoverable and doesn't keep up with what's going on in reality, that's like the clerical mistake. That's the ultimate gotcha in court with your pants are down. And it turns from it's an innocent mistake that adds zeros to the checkbook. And you just mentioned that. I just thought it was worth calling out because we've seen it.
Yeah, and you're so right, Scott. I'm going to be going to a conference in a couple of months, and one of the topics that we're going to address is safety handbooks and company handbooks and how they can be used as a shield or a sword.
Yep.
And this is one of those recipes that we were talking about. Like, what am I seeing today that plaintiff's attorneys are really focusing on? And it's the company handbook. And I think a lot of times trucking companies' safety personnel generate these handbooks and create them from a safety standpoint, which makes sense. I mean, you're coming up with a handbook because you want to have guidelines and rules for your employees to follow. And the safety folks don't think about, how will these be used by a plaintiff's attorney down the road? And some of the language in there that we see, like, we will be the safest trucking company, or we vow that we're the safest trucking company, and our drivers are the safest. That type of language sounds really great in practice, but what ends up happening is that trucking company is now creating a much higher duty of care on themselves, where the plaintiff's attorney can say, it is your policy to have the safest driver. Now let's look at this driver. He had 2 non-movable accidents in the last 3 years, and you allowed this person to drive. Is that the safest driver? If that person who's being deposed isn't prepared, they may say, no, that's not the safest. Okay, but even if he disagrees, you said it would be the safest. And so my point is you have to be really careful about the language in your handbooks, because you're thinking about it from a really good place of safety, but let's think about how it can be used against you. So some of that language really needs to be readdressed or toned down.
And if I can, I'm going to riff on that of taking it to how it can be used against you. And in full circle, nobody remembers rules anyways. And we were describing that. I just went back, I think it was like 10 years ago when I was getting my MBA. we compared. I went to Ball and Walls. Their handbook was 90 pages long. And the professor from Ball and Walls was just laughing because every time someone did something dumb, we put a rule in the handbook, and then that's how it went from 7 to 90 over the course of time. And I imagine there's some handbooks out there that are the same. Then he brought in where he came from, Lubrizol, which is at the time a $7 billion company. I don't know how big they are now, but it's a B. Guess how long their company handbook was?
I assume much smaller than that.
5 pages. And it was pillars and guidelines and principles. And because you can't create a rule for every scenario, you can create principles for people to follow, a mission and a vision statement, but then you leave it up to your people to make decisions at the time. So not only is that better in a court case situation, guess what? You're actually driving people to do something, what it's supposed to be doing in the first place, which is aligning your people. And so to say from both an inspiring your people and a defendable standpoint, it's the right move. And so if you take a look at your handbook, and it was greater than 5 pages, figure out how you can get it lower for all the reasons that we just discussed.
Perfectly said.
So with that, Rob, we're right at time. What's your last parting shot for the audience?
Nothing. Just that, Gallagher Sharp is a firm that's all throughout Ohio. We're also in Michigan as well. We are made up of trucking attorneys here. We are a full service law firm. So, we handle med mal type cases, legal mal cases, employment cases, estate planning type issues. But part of our really big practice here is our trucking group. And we know what we're doing. Our trucking group has been in this industry for many, many years. For me, it's almost 15 or so. And so we're here to help. And we're the good guys. We're trying to get the word out that the trucking industry is a great industry. The things on the shelves at the grocery store, your COVID vaccines, your Amazon deliveries, it comes from someplace. And most of the time it comes from a truck, through a logistics company perhaps. And so this industry and business is just so vital and important, and we need to get that word out there.
Amen. It's still true. If you bought a truck, brought it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Rob Boroff, partner of Gallagher Sharp. We'll have contact information in the follow-up. Rob, thank you for the time and sharing your wisdom so we can keep our seats full with safe professional drivers. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Scott. Really appreciate it.